Jonathan Miller had spent his entire life building an empire. But on that night, what stunned him was not the numbers printed on any report, but the sound of a knife striking a cutting board in an empty kitchen at 2:47 in the morning. A sound so strange that it tightened his chest like a warning that something had gone terribly wrong. Jonathan, 53 years old, CEO of the renowned Hearthstone Kitchen restaurant chain, stood wearing an old maintenance uniform and a frayed baseball cap hiding the identity of a man. The entire culinary industry grew cautious around whenever he walked into a boardroom. But tonight, he was only Dave Nolan, an anonymous technician with scuffed safety boots and the faint smell of machine oil clinging to his wrists, a name the company had assigned to the man sent to the Pittsburgh branch to inspect a refrigeration issue. No one here recognized his face, and that was exactly why Jonathan was standing in a place no ordinary CEO would ever set foot in. The lingering scent of minced garlic from the previous shift still floated in the air, clinging to the edges of the stainless steel counters fogged with moisture. Jonathan walked slowly, each step heavy, but his heartbeat raced, as if his instincts were urging him not to overlook that sound. And then, under the tired flicker of fluorescent lights, he saw a lean but sturdy figure bent over a cutting board. The young man looked barely in his early 20s, dark hair falling over his forehead, his white chef's coat impeccably clean, in a way that made no sense at this hour. The knife in his hand glided through carrots, each slice identical, as if measured. No heavy breathing, no muttering, no music, no phone. Only the steady rhythm of steel meeting wood, like a heartbeat trying to keep itself alive. Jonathan stood there longer than he should have. Something about this young man held him in place. An obsession. A quiet desperation hidden behind every flawless cut. And something else. Something that reminded him of the days he once stood alone in the kitchen of his very first restaurant, when success was only a dream, and overdue bills were the only reality. He spoke trying to sound casual, like a maintenance guy passing through. "Working this late, huh?" The knife paused in midair. The young man looked up. For a brief second, fear flashed in his eyes, then immediately shifted into the guarded expression of someone who had learned to live quietly to avoid being noticed. "Oh, you're the new guy, right?" Dave Jonathan nodded. The young man lowered his head again and resumed chopping, though his hands were no longer as fluid under the weight of being watched. "You always do prep at this hour?" "Yes, someone has to." His voice was not sad, not cheerful, just stretched thin like a guitar string, pulled too tight, and waiting for a single touch to snap. "Daytime gets really busy. They need everything ready." Jonathan leaned lightly against the counter, pretending to be casual, but his mind was already connecting details into a growing question. Why would someone this young and this skilled be working alone in the dark at an hour when the world slept? As he turned to leave, a small corner of paper caught his eye. A photo taped to the edge of the stainless steel shelf. A smiling teenage boy with his arms around a woman with gentle eyes. The faded words beneath it read, "Mom, our last good day." Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. A CEO normally would not stop at a photograph, but a human being would. And that night, for the first time in years, Jonathan realized he was not looking at an employee. He was looking at a secret, a silent whisper saying, "Don't leave. Find out." That was the moment everything began. And it was also the moment Jonathan Miller, the man the industry called the King of Fire and Flame, realized he was about to step into a story powerful enough to change his own life. Jonathan paused for a beat before stepping into the break room, where the harsh neon light washed over Liam's face, making the dark circles under his eyes stand out even more, like bruises from a battle, only he had been silently fighting. Liam sat alone at a corner table, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago, his eyes staring blankly into nothing, as if trying to anchor himself in the middle of a storm of exhaustion. Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat across from him, asking no small talk, simply placing his presence into the quiet space the young man had retreated into, like it was the last layer of armor he still had. When Jonathan asked why he was working the night shift, yet showed up at this hour, Liam took a slow breath and answered in an even steady tone, without complaint, without pleading, just the bare truth of someone who had long accepted carrying more than he should. They were short-staffed today, so he took a double shift. When Jonathan asked when he last slept, Liam's shoulders froze as if the question had touched the deepest wound inside him. He looked away, searching for an easy answer, but finally let out a single word that sounded more like a confession than a reply. A long time. Jonathan looked at him and saw not just a tired worker, but a mountain of weight crushing a pair of thin, overworked shoulders, and for the first time in his life, all the numbers, profit margins, and standardized procedures felt strangely meaningless. The young man in front of him was not simply tired, he was coming apart. Liam's silence spoke louder than the words he tried to avoid. He did not want anyone digging too deep. He did not want anyone touching the secret he had spent his entire youth protecting. But when Jonathan mentioned the scholarship, something flickered in Liam's eyes like a shard of broken glass catching the light by accident. He tried to change the subject, tried to act unaffected, but a flash of pain surfaced and vanished instantly so quickly that if Jonathan had not seen that same look of regret in many young chefs who had lost their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he might have missed it. Liam finally exhaled the way someone breathes after fighting so long they have forgotten what relief feels like. He said he once earned a full scholarship to a prestigious culinary institute in New England, that he had packed his suitcase, believed he would walk into the kitchens of renowned restaurants. But then everything collapsed too fast for him to do anything except watch his dream fall apart like a paper house in a windstorm. Before Jonathan could ask more, the door swung open. Dennis appeared with a flushed face and a sharp, irritated voice, like a pressure cooker about to explode. Liam immediately stood up straight, the reflex of someone too used to having their dreams interrupted by someone else's demands. But Jonathan saw what Dennis did not see, the way Liam's hand turned pale from gripping too hard, the slight sway in his posture, from prolonged exhaustion, and the way he swallowed every emotion just to answer with a short phrase that sounded like a survival instinct drilled into him. "Yes, I am coming right now." Jonathan watched him walk away, each step heavy, as though every footfall cost one more piece of the last energy he had left. When the door closed, Jonathan knew one thing for certain: this young man was carrying a story so painful he had no choice but to hide it in silence. And he knew a second thing just as clearly. Liam Carter had just unintentionally opened the door that would lead Jonathan into the most dangerous part of this undercover mission, the part a CEO should never step into. But Jonathan had already decided. He would see it through to the end. Because that young man deserved to be seen, to be understood, and to be saved before it was too late. Jonathan left the break room with a rising unease pressing against each heartbeat, as if an invisible hand were pulling him toward the darkness where Liam's secrets were carefully hidden. The night shift ended at 6 o'clock in the morning, and Liam should have gone straight home to sleep after nearly 16 hours of continuous work. Yet when Jonathan watched from the parking lot, the young man did not drive toward downtown Pittsburgh, like most employees who lived nearby. Instead, he turned in the opposite direction toward the quiet roads leading out of the city. Liam drove an old Civic so worn that the silver paint had been scraped away by time, but the way his hand rested on the steering wheel was too neat, too careful, like someone who had lived his whole life knowing he could not afford a single mistake. Jonathan kept his distance, following with the instinct of someone who had learned how to uncover truth from the smallest details. The HR file he had received the previous night, opened under the dim yellow light of his hotel room, hovered in his mind. Liam, 21 years old, no college degree. His only emergency contact was his mother, Angela Carter, living in a small town outside the city of Erie. No information about a father. No recent hospital records. Too many empty spaces that Jonathan had already begun filling with worry. When the Civic turned into a quiet neighborhood, Jonathan immediately sensed the contrast. The homes were not poor, but they carried a weary stillness, like families holding on with everything they had left. Liam stopped in front of a small, pale blue house, tidy in a way that felt almost strange compared to the peeling paint near the porch. He stepped out, lifted a bag of groceries from the back seat, and walked up the steps with the heavy gait of someone who no longer knew where exhaustion ended and routine began. When the door opened, Jonathan stood far away, yet the sight inside froze him where he was. The living room was no longer a living room. It had become a hospital room. A medical bed with lift rails, a heart monitor, an oxygen tube, a fluid pump, and a compact medication cart lined the wall. On the bed lay a woman so thin her clothes looked like they were hanging from a frame, her neck secured in a brace, her arms motionless on a towel. Even from the sidewalk, Jonathan could see the smile she managed to give Liam, a smile so fragile it tightened something deep in his chest. Liam took off his jacket, went to her bedside, and touched her hair with a tenderness no textbook could teach. He checked the ventilator, took out a bowl of oatmeal from the grocery bag, sat beside his mother, and fed her spoon by spoon, slowly, patiently, with a devotion that felt sacred. It was not a performance for anyone. It was not obligation. It was love. And it was a burden. Jonathan saw it in the slight tremor of Liam's body from lack of sleep, yet he also saw the way the young man's eyes brightened whenever his mother whispered a few soft words. When Liam opened the medication log and recorded each dose in precise, steady handwriting, Jonathan understood. This young man was not just a night shift cook. He was a nurse, a caretaker, a medical aide, a guardian keeping his mother alive. All on his own. Jonathan stepped back, then another step, as if the truth in front of him was so heavy it pushed the air from his lungs. He had thought Liam was simply a young man working nights because he needed money. He had thought he went undercover to solve a staffing problem. But now he stood face to face with an answer he had never been prepared to face. Liam was not working to survive. He was working to save a life. Angela Carter lifted her head, slightly smiling at something her son said that made her let out a faint laugh, and that small moment shattered the emotional distance Jonathan had tried to maintain. For the first time in many years, the seasoned CEO felt his throat tighten. There are things leaders never see from an office high above the ground. There are people holding their worlds together with trembling hands. And Liam Carter was one of them. Jonathan turned away, but his heart left behind a vow, a silent one. He would not let that young man keep fighting alone. Not for one more night. Jonathan stood in the restaurant's walk-in freezer, with his breath turning into thin clouds of frost. But what chilled him was not the cold air. It was the truth, waiting to be uncovered. He had seen enough to know Liam Carter could not hold on much longer yet to understand the full weight of what the young man had sacrificed. Jonathan needed to hear it from him directly. So he waited until Liam finished the last order, then gently placed a hand on his shoulder and signaled toward the freezer. Liam looked at him the way someone looks at a door they do not want to open, but no longer have the strength to refuse. Inside, the harsh white light reflected against Liam's pale face, revealing the deep, exhausted grooves beneath his eyes. Jonathan stood close to the shelves stacked with produce, trying to keep his voice calm as he asked about the Culinary Institute. The question struck Liam like a blade plunging into the part of his memory he had buried alive. He froze. What appeared in his eyes was not anger and not defensiveness, but a very human fear, the fear of someone terrified that another person might finally see the pain he had been hiding. He turned away, inhaling slowly, as if trying to soothe the wound that the question had ripped open. When he spoke, his voice came out low and raspy, stripped of every layer of protection. He had once been accepted into the Culinary Institute of New England, a full scholarship at the age of 18. He said it not like someone describing an achievement, but like someone speaking of something precious that once belonged to him, but now existed only as a broken shard of glass. Liam recounted it slowly, his tone moving like footsteps through a past filled with thorns. He had prepared everything: paperwork suitcases, dorm assignments, class schedules. He truly believed his life was finally opening a door for him. But then the accident happened. His mother was hit by a drunk driver at an intersection at the exact moment he was out buying books for the upcoming semester. In the freezer, Jonathan heard every word, like the sound of something priceless shattering. Liam said the doctors explained that his mother would never be able to move again from the chest down, that she needed 24-hour care, that someone had to watch her at all times. He said his father could not handle the pressure and left the house 2 months after the accident, leaving behind the home, the bills, and one final sentence: "I cannot do this." Jonathan saw Liam's hand clench so tightly that his fingertips turned white at the memory. He did not cry. He had probably cried himself dry long ago. He gave up the scholarship. Not because he did not want to go, but because he simply could not. There was no one else to care for his mother. He could not afford a nurse. At the very moment he stepped into adulthood, he had to choose between his future and the life of the person he loved most. He chose his mother. When Liam spoke about those first months, his voice trembled slightly, as though the memories still carried the sharpness of a blade. 3 jobs at once, 2 hours of sleep a day, learning wound care through online videos, learning how to change ventilator tubes through hospital tutorials, learning to reposition his mother every 2 hours, to prevent bed sores, learning to prepare pureed meals so she would not choke. Jonathan stood across from him, realizing he was witnessing something many leaders never understand in their entire careers. Some employees are not lazy, not irresponsible, not weak. They are simply surviving. Liam took a deep breath and said the night shift was the only solution, working 8 hours, driving 40 minutes home, caring for his mother all day, getting 2 hours of sleep before returning to the restaurant. He gave a faint smile, one so sad it felt like a needle piercing straight into Jonathan's chest. He said he had gotten used to it. But Jonathan saw the truth. No one on earth ever gets used to carrying an entire life on the shoulders of one person. Then Liam finished with a voice barely above a whisper. "I do not regret it. I am just tired." A dull ache passed through Jonathan. It was the first sentence he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Restaurants' revenue, expenses, performance metrics, all of it felt small compared to those words. And when Dennis suddenly opened the door, snapping irritably and ordering Liam back to the kitchen immediately, Jonathan saw what Dennis never would. This young man had fought long enough, and without someone to catch him, he would fall. Jonathan watched Liam walk out of the freezer and realized his decision was complete. He would pull him out of the abyss, even if he had to do something no CEO had ever done. Even if it meant exposing the flaws of the very system he had built. Even if it meant standing against the world. Jonathan walked into the restaurant that night with the feeling of a storm slowly tightening inside his chest, because he knew he was about to witness the worst thing that could happen to Liam Carter. And just as his instincts warned, the atmosphere in the kitchen was thick, heavy, like a room that had just lost power. Everyone stood staring at the newly posted announcement on the bulletin board with expressions of confusion, avoidance, or a kind of silent desperation that kept them from speaking. Jonathan moved closer, reading every line, and each sentence felt like a cold blade slicing into his awareness. Eliminate all night shift prep. Push all prep work into the daytime shift. Keep only one employee overnight to handle the few late-hour customers. Optimize operational costs. And Jonathan understood exactly what that meant. Liam was losing his job. Or worse, he would be forced into a shift he could not possibly work. Either outcome led to the same end. The fragile world Liam was fighting to hold together for his mother would collapse because of one emotionless decision in an email. Jonathan's hand clenched the paper until the edges curled, and inside him was a flash of guilt as sharp as the fluorescent light that had fallen across Liam's face the night they first met. This was his fault. The consequence of a policy he had signed 6 months earlier to increase efficiency. Jonathan walked straight into the kitchen. Liam stood in his usual corner, his hand trembling slightly as he held the knife, trying to keep the slicing rhythm even like a clock hand already off balance, but refusing to stop. When Jonathan asked if he had seen the announcement, Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing to cut, as if he had not heard. But Jonathan saw the tightening of his shoulders, saw the way his breath slipped out of him as though he no longer had the strength to hold it in. "What are you going to do?" Jonathan asked gently, as if asking about the weather. Liam did not look at him. His voice was eerily calm, as if his soul had stepped out of his body and left the shell behind to answer. "Find another job. Try to see if any place needs night shift workers. Hope he can pay the bills this month. Hope he can keep the house. Hope his mother does not end up in a state facility." Then he laughed. A small, dry, cracked sound, like the noise a heart makes when it hits the floor. Jonathan felt like he had watched a young man's spirit shatter on the tiles. Before he could say a single word, Dennis stormed in like anger made human. He barked at Liam for falling behind. Schedule demanded to know what he was getting paid for his voice sharp and cutting, as if Liam were the greatest obstacle in his life. Jonathan stood beside them and watched the invisible blows land each word, making Liam shrink, step back, fold himself inward, as if trying to protect every part of him from wounds that did not touch skin, but pierced straight through the heart. Dennis lifted an onion Liam had just chopped and scoffed, uneven. Amateur work. But Jonathan had already seen why it was uneven. Liam's hands were shaking, not from fear, from a body that had been past its safety limit for far too long. He was chopping vegetables with the strength of someone who was nearly completely depleted. When Dennis left, Liam tried to keep going, but the blade tapped weakly against the board instead of gliding the way it normally did. Jonathan looked at him and asked, "Have you eaten?" Liam answered. "I'm fine." Jonathan asked again, "Have you eaten?" And Liam burst out louder than usual, like a spark snapping from a breaking string. "I said I'm fine." But 1 second later, the entire facade collapsed. He apologized. Apologized for snapping, apologized for being tired, apologized for existing. Jonathan felt the sting of that more deeply than any story he had ever heard. He forced Liam to take a break, forced him to eat. Liam ate like someone who had not put real food in his body for days. He sank onto a plastic chair, trembling, exhausted, breathing fast. And for the first time since Jonathan met him, Liam buried his face in his hands and cried. Not loud cries, the slow, aching kind, the kind that comes from someone who has been strong for far too long. He said he was afraid of losing the house, afraid of losing his mother, afraid that a single decision made by someone who had never met him could take away everything he was trying to hold on to. Jonathan wanted to tell him he would fix it, wanted to say that he would be all right. But he could not. Not as Dave Nolan. Not in a maintenance uniform. Not while the truth remained hidden. The only thing he could do was place a hand on Liam's shoulder and say in the voice of a man who had seen too many tragedies, but never a soul as resilient as this one, "You are not alone." But he knew that sentence alone would not save him, and Jonathan Miller made his decision. Liam Carter's life would be rewritten beginning tonight. Jonathan found Liam in the dry storage room at 4:37 in the morning, but not working. The young man was curled up between 2 large sacks of rice, his chef's jacket rolled into a makeshift pillow beneath his head, his breathing steady but weak, as if his body had finally been forced to shut itself down just to survive. The sight hit Jonathan like a blow he never saw coming, leaving him frozen in place. A 21-year-old boy sleeping like an exhausted child on a storeroom floor, because if he did not collapse on his own, his body would have done it for him. Not a lazy person, not an irresponsible worker, but someone who had been fighting far too long in the dark, with no one watching. Jonathan sat beside him, gently draping his maintenance jacket over the young man's body like an apology, whispered without words. An apology for coming too late, for letting the very system he built corner someone this young into such a breaking point. In the storage room's dim yellow light, with only the soft flutter of the ventilation fan, Jonathan felt as if he could hear small cracks radiating from inside the boy on the floor, cracks in hope, cracks in perseverance, cracks in endurance. He stood there like a guard on duty, his eyes never leaving Liam, determined to keep anyone, even Dennis, from interrupting this rare moment of rest. When the shift finally ended, Jonathan left the restaurant not as an undercover CEO, completing an assignment, but as a man carrying an unspoken command carved into his chest: save this kid at any cost. From that moment, his mission was no longer investigate the branch or optimize staffing. It became something personal, almost instinctive, the mission to rebuild the life of Liam Carter with the same hands that had once built an empire. Jonathan returned to the temporary office in his hotel, closed the door, sank into the leather chair, and for the first time in many years, his mind did not drift toward profit shareholders or quarterly reports. He thought only of the boy sleeping in the storeroom, the boy carrying his mother's life, and carrying the burden left by a society full of gaps he had to fill alone. He opened his laptop, his hands trembling slightly with anger at himself. He reviewed Liam's file again, noting every expense, every care requirement Angela needed, every tuition cost Liam had lost. He called Jennifer, the head of human resources, even though morning had not yet arrived. Her voice came through surprised and worried, but Jonathan did not waste time. He demanded all medical reports, insurance coverage details, caregiving costs, and a list of the most reputable online culinary programs that could help Liam return to the path he had been forced to abandon. Jennifer fell silent for a very long second before asking, "You really want to help that kid, don't you?" Jonathan closed his eyes and saw again the image of Liam curled on the cold floor. "I owe him," he answered, his voice low and solid as stone. "This entire system owes him." That night he did not sleep. He called Marcus, the COO, to pave the way for a position transfer. He called the finance department to prepare a special fund. He called the legal team to find a way to support medical care without violating compliance rules. By the time the sun stretched its first light across the curtains, Jonathan was still sitting upright, his eyes red from staying awake, but carrying the unwavering focus of a man who had just made the biggest decision of his life. Not a business deal, not a $1 million negotiation, but the act of saving a life quietly sinking beneath exhaustion. And when he walked into the restaurant the next day, he was no longer Dave Nolan. He was Jonathan Miller, the one person capable of rewriting Liam Carter's fate. And this time he would not fail. Jonathan stepped into the mock interview room with his heart pounding in heavy, deliberate beats, not because he feared being exposed, but because he knew that the moment he walked through that door, Liam Carter's life would change in a way the young man could never imagine. In the temporary studio space, arranged to look like a conference room, Liam sat on a gray metal chair, his hands clasped tightly on the table, trying to stay composed, though his shoulders were pulled so tense it looked as if a single touch could shatter him. The studio lights illuminated his thin face, revealing the dark circles that had not yet faded even after getting a little sleep the night before, only because his body had collapsed from exhaustion. He had no idea why he had been chosen for this interview. No idea why the company had asked him to come all the way to the regional office in Cleveland. No idea that every camera pointed at him was there to capture a story that would leave the entire executive board in stunned silence. Jonathan stood behind the frosted glass door, observing Liam through the narrow opening, as if looking at a younger version of himself from 3 decades earlier, a time when he too had been underestimated, dismissed as someone with no future, pushed away from doors he later forced open with his own hands. The producers asked Liam gentle questions: how long he had worked there, what he liked about the job, what made the night shift difficult. Liam answered politely, respectfully, almost endearingly enough to make something twist painfully inside Jonathan. The boy believed this was just a productivity survey. He had no idea he was standing at the center of the biggest reveal of his life. When the producer said they would be bringing in a senior executive, Liam nodded and tried to appear calm, but Jonathan saw it clearly, the way his hands tightened, as if bracing for judgment, for reprimand, for someone to see through the exhaustion he had hidden for far too long. Then the cue sounded in Jonathan's earpiece. It was time. He took a deep breath and walked in. When the door opened, Liam turned his head, and for the first second, he saw only Dave, the kind maintenance guy who talked to him during breaks. But 1 second later, his eyes froze. Jonathan was no longer wearing the maintenance uniform. No longer had the cap pulled over his eyes. No longer hid behind the grease smudges that disguised his face. He stepped into the room wearing a dark, tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted, carrying the presence of a man who had signed hundreds of contracts, the man behind the entire Hearthstone kitchen chain. The studio lights struck him clearly, revealing every detail that made it impossible for Liam to deny what he was seeing. Dave, the young man, stammered, his voice trembling like a guitar string pulled too tight. Why are you dressed? Jonathan removed the maintenance cap, the final piece of his disguise, and set it on the table. My name is not Dave Nolan, he said slowly and clearly, as if he wanted each syllable to land with the weight of a truth Liam had spent years avoiding. My name is Jonathan Miller. The air fell into a thick silence. Liam pushed his chair back, his heartbeat racing, his mouth open with no words forming. In his eyes was fear, betrayal, panic. He thought he was about to be fired, thought he was being punished, thought he was being exposed. You followed me, his voice cracked. You went to my house. You saw everything. Jonathan nodded, refusing to look away. I crossed boundaries I should not have. I am sorry, but I could not stand by and watch you drown in silence. Liam shot up from his chair, tears of anger rising under the bright lights. You had no right. No one has the right to know that I never asked anyone for help. I just wanted to keep my job. His voice broke, each word pulled out of him like it hurt. If you want to fire me, just say it. A long moment of silence followed. The producers held their breath. Jonathan stepped forward, but his eyes were no longer those of a CEO. They were the eyes of a man who had watched someone collapse under a weight far too heavy and had arrived just in time to catch them. Liam, he said, his voice low and rough, I did not come here to take your job. I came to give you back the life you lost. The room went still like water after a storm suddenly settling. Liam stood there, trembling, unsure if he should believe any of it. And in that moment, Jonathan knew. He had arrived at exactly the right time. The door was open. And from this day forward, the life of Liam Carter would never be the same again. Jonathan sat down on the folding chair across from Liam, but this time not as an anonymous maintenance man, rather as someone who had seen the deepest edge of the young man's despair and had decided he would not let him carry another second of it alone. The air inside the studio room thickened like a storm waiting to break, but suspended in the final moment before thunder struck. Liam remained standing, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His face was tense, his dark eyes wide, no longer filled with the initial shock, but with a painful mix of hurt, confusion, and the fear of being stripped bare. Jonathan looked at him and exhaled softly, as if afraid any louder sound might break Liam's already fragile composure. He knew this was a moment that required a heart, not a title. Liam, please sit down. The young man shook his head, breath unsteady, like someone cornered with no way out. I don't understand. You are the CEO. You are Jonathan Miller. He said the name as if it were an accusation. Why were you there? Why pretend to be someone else? Why come to my house? I didn't do anything wrong. Jonathan raised both hands, not as a command, not with authority, but as an apology in gesture. You did nothing wrong. There is nothing in your life that deserves surveillance or judgment. Then why Liam's voice cracked in broken pieces. Why spend a whole week watching me struggle? Why watch me fall apart and pretend you didn't see it? Why let me be terrified all that time? Jonathan felt his own throat tighten with the cruelty of the truth, that to save him he first had to witness him hurt. I came to understand, he said quietly, to see the things reports would never show me, to see the person instead of the numbers. And when I saw you, I knew I had to do something. But I could not act without knowing the whole story. Liam let out a hollow laugh and wiped his tears with the back of his hand. Story. My life isn't a story. It's a mess. There's nothing to tell except that I'm just trying to keep my mom alive one day at a time." Jonathan stepped closer, speaking gently as if holding something fragile. "Exactly. That is why I needed to step into your life, not to expose it, to fix what never should have been broken." Liam stared at him for a long, disbelieving moment, as if trying to detect a trap. "I don't need anyone to fix me." "You don't need fixing," Jonathan said firmly. "You just need the weight taken off your shoulders, and there is nothing wrong with that." Silence filled the room, dense enough that Jonathan felt the air itself thinning. Then Liam finally sat down slowly, as if his body was surrendering after months of resistance. He brought both hands to his face, breathing deeply, his voice trembling as he said, "I used to think if I just pushed a little harder, everything would be okay. Just a little more, and I'd make it. But the harder I push, the more it feels like I'm choking myself." Jonathan felt a sharp ache in his chest. "You should not have to live like that. No one should have to live like that." Liam inhaled deeply and lifted his head. His eyes were red and tired, but a tiny glimmer remained. A glimmer that comes only when someone has been hurting too long to keep hiding. "What did you see at my house?" Jonathan swallowed the tightness in his voice and answered honestly, "I saw a son who loves his mother enough to sacrifice his entire future. I saw a young man teaching himself medical care just to make sure she gets one more day. I saw a spirit stronger than any chef I have ever trained." Liam's voice cracked. "You saw my mom? I saw her smile at you as if that smile was the one thing keeping her connected to this world," Jonathan said. "And I saw you fall apart behind a door no one else was allowed to see behind." A tear slid down Liam's cheek and hit the table with a small, painful sound. "I don't want her to know. She would break if she knew I gave up my dream because of her." Jonathan nodded gently. "I know." Liam tightened his fists. "So what are you going to do, fire me? Move me to another shift? Make everyone see me as the guy who can't go anywhere?" Jonathan shook his head, stunned that Liam still thought he was about to be discarded. "I did not come here to take your job. I came to give back the life you put away in a drawer for 3 years. Liam stared at him in complete disbelief. Jonathan continued slowly and deliberately. "I want your mother to receive proper care. I want you to have the chance to study culinary arts again, even if in a more flexible way. I want you to have time to breathe, to sleep, to live like a 21-year-old should be allowed to live." Liam opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyelids trembled as if he were fighting an emotional wave he could no longer hold back. Why he whispered so quietly, it was almost gone. "Why would you care about my life?" Jonathan gave a soft, pained smile, a mix of sorrow and self-blame. "Because I have met many talented people, but very few strong ones. And among all of them, you are the strongest person I have ever met." Liam broke down again, but this time it was not the cry of despair. It was the cry of someone who just realized he did not have to fight alone anymore. Jonathan stepped forward, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and spoke like making a vow with his entire being. "From now on, I will be the one standing behind you." The studio fell silent, the lights reflecting in Liam's eyes, eyes that for the first time in many long months recognized what hope felt like. Jonathan did not know how long the road ahead would be, how costly, or how complicated. He knew only one thing he would see it through, and that night, as he looked at the young man who had been carrying more than any 21-year-old ever should, Jonathan Miller understood he was not just saving an employee. He was saving a family. And in return, that young man was saving the part of Jonathan he thought had died long ago. Jonathan stood in front of the pale blue house on Maple Street that afternoon with a strange sensation, as if he were stepping into a battle while also standing before a blank page that needed to be rewritten from the beginning. When Liam opened the door, he looked different. The exhaustion was still etched into his features, but the panic from the previous days was gone. There was something lighter in his eyes, as if simply knowing he did not have to fight alone anymore had allowed him to stand taller. He invited Jonathan inside his voice, still slightly shy, like someone not yet used to letting others into his private world. In the living room, Angela Carter sat in a new wheelchair, the one Jonathan had arranged to be delivered that very morning. Her eyes, when they met his, were a mixture of gratitude, uncertainty, and the quiet fear of a mother who wanted nothing more than for her son to be safe. Jonathan knelt down to her eye level, not out of formality, but because he wanted her to see him as a person, not a CEO. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "we're here today to return to Liam what he gave up for you." Angela lifted a trembling hand, trying her best to reach his. "I don't deserve this. My son has sacrificed enough because of me." Thomas, the company's COO, placed a folder on the table. Jennifer, the head of HR, opened each document with precision, as if she were resetting the order of the lives in front of her. Jonathan began to explain everything one step at a time, clear and slow, so Angela would not feel overwhelmed. The company would cover all her medical expenses for 12 months. They would hire a personal nurse for both day and night shifts. The house would be renovated to accommodate specialist equipment. Liam would be transferred to a branch closer to home as head of the prep department with a flexible schedule and a salary high enough that the two of them would no longer fear month-to-month collapse. The company's education division would fully sponsor a bachelor's degree in culinary arts through an accredited online program starting in the spring semester. When Jonathan said this, Liam stood behind his mother's chair, gripping the backrest. Jonathan noticed the slight shudder of his shoulders, as if he had just heard something he once believed he would never hear again. "I get to study again." The words slipped out, barely louder than a whisper. So soft, Jonathan had to look directly into his eyes to confirm that Liam had truly spoken them. "Yes," Jonathan answered, without hesitation. "And you'll study as someone who deserves it, not as someone being pitied." Angela burst into tears. The sound of it nearly made Liam collapse, but he forced himself to stay upright, resting a steadying hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her, even as he was falling apart inside. Jennifer handed over an envelope containing a $15,000 support check for repairs and the things you need immediately. Angela shook her head, overwhelmed. Why do all of this? We have nothing to give back." Jonathan met her gaze with a sincerity so deep that even he felt a sharp ache in his chest. "You don't owe anything. Liam already paid. With 3 years of sacrifice, none of us deserve to be compared to." Liam lowered his forehead to his mother's shoulder. He could not wrap his arms around her, could not pull her into an embrace, but the gentle touch alone was one of the most beautiful sights Jonathan had ever witnessed in any kitchen or boardroom. After all the documents were signed, the tension in the room eased, warming slowly into something that resembled hope, a word neither of them had dared to speak in a long time. When Jonathan prepared to leave, Liam walked him to the door. Why are you doing all this for me?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, but without the fear or defensiveness from before. Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Because you lived like an adult long before anyone should have been forced to grow up. Because you showed me that real strength is not shouting or fighting, but standing tall every day for someone you love. Liam drew a deep breath, his eyes red but shining. "I won't let you down." Jonathan smiled. "I know. Because I saw you at your worst. Just imagine if you were that strong, exhausted, how far can you go once you finally get to rest?" Liam let out a small laugh through his tears. The first real laugh he had allowed himself in years. As Jonathan stepped off the porch, he looked back at the doorway where the two of them stood. Angela sitting in her new wheelchair, Liam behind her with his hands gently resting on the handles, both smiling into the golden light spilling through the curtains. And he understood from this moment forward they were no longer being pushed into a corner by life. They were stepping out of it. And somehow he had become the one clearing the path for them. Jonathan stood before the glass doors of the new Hearthstone Kitchen branch in Buffalo that afternoon, where red ribbons fluttered lightly in the wind and the sound of reporters' cameras clicking formed a backdrop that felt like the soundtrack to a milestone. 6 months ago, this place was only a blueprint. 6 months ago, Liam Carter was just a worn-out prep cook collapsing asleep in a storeroom. 6 months ago, Angela survived on an oxygen tube, and the faint, fragile smile she saved only for her son. And yet today they were all standing here. They had stepped out of the shadows. The restaurant was wide and bright, featuring an open kitchen built exactly upon Jonathan's philosophy. Customers should see the people cooking for them, and cooks should see the people they serve. No one would be hidden behind steel doors anymore. No one would fight alone in forgotten corners. When the familiar Civic pulled into the parking lot, Jonathan immediately noticed it was no longer the battered car that had once pained him to see. It was washed tidy, and even the license plate was properly fixed, like a symbol of a life being rearranged into order. Liam stepped out first, wearing a black culinary jacket embroidered with the words Chef Liam Carter, Assistant Kitchen Director across the chest. There was no more shrinking posture, no more folded shoulders of someone afraid of being called out. He walked straight and certain, each step filled with a new confidence that seemed to lift his entire presence. But what made Jonathan's throat tighten was the person in the wheelchair behind him. Angela Carter. Her hair was neatly brushed, her neck brace replaced with a lighter version, and a lavender shawl draped gracefully across her shoulders. And her smile, a real one, no longer trembling, no longer masking pain. A smile like sunlight cutting through thick fog. Nurse Kesha pushed her chair, and behind them Liam's grandmother, freshly flown in from Arizona, beamed proudly as she recorded everything on her phone. Liam guided his mother through the crowd, bowing politely to everyone, but constantly glancing back to check on Angela with a reflex born from pure love. When they reached Jonathan, the two simply looked at each other for a single second, but Liam's nod carried an entire language of emotion that words could never carry. "I made it. Because of you," and Jonathan answered with his eyes. "Not because of me. Because you didn't give up." The ribbon-cutting ceremony began, reporters jostling for the best angle, employees lining up like it was a festival. But Jonathan saw only one moment, the moment Liam placed his hand on the scissors, the same hands that once trembled from exhaustion in Pittsburgh, now steady, full of life. Liam lifted his head, took a deep breath, and spoke into the microphone before cutting the ribbon. 6 months ago, I thought I had hit the bottom of my life. I thought there was no way forward. But today, I stand here not just as a chef, but as someone who was given a second chance. He turned to his mother. Angela placed her frail hand over his. "My son taught me what strength looks like," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And Mr. Miller, he showed me that there are people in this world who can see that strength." Applause erupted like a wave. And in that moment, Liam cut the ribbon. One clean, decisive slice, the kind he used to make chopping carrots at 3 a.m, but this time not in isolation. The crowd cheered. Employees opened the doors. Light flooded the space. The scents of warm dishes drifted out, pulling people inside, with an atmosphere buzzing with life. But Jonathan paused for a moment outside the entrance, quietly pulling out his phone. He opened his photo album and looked at the picture of Liam asleep in the walk-in freezer. The swollen eyes, the curled-up body, a boy trying to survive. Jonathan stared at it for a long while. Then he tapped delete, not to forget, but because he no longer needed proof of anything. The Liam standing here today was not the boy who collapsed on a cold floor. He was the man stepping into his new kitchen, calling out orders, directing the line cooks, tasting broth, adjusting plating, moving with the confidence of someone who finally knew he belonged. Jonathan followed the crowd inside, standing near the open kitchen, watching Liam coordinate his very first shift. The young man's smile was warm, his voice steady, every motion radiating the confidence that 6 months ago was nothing more than ash. And when Liam looked up and caught Jonathan's eyes through the glass window, he smiled, not a tired smile, not a forced one, but the true smile of someone who had found himself again. He mouthed 2 small words, but Jonathan saw them clearly. "Thank you." Jonathan did not reply. He simply nodded because the truth was, "Thank you for reminding me why I started." The grand opening night flowed with laughter, the rhythm of knives on cutting boards, customers' delighted reactions, and the quiet pride of a young man who had once been trapped between duty and exhaustion. When night fell, the restaurant remained bright. The kitchen stayed alive. And Liam Carter, once buried under responsibility, fatigue, and despair, now stood in the center of the light, steady alive, fully living the dream he once believed he had lost forever. Jonathan sat at a corner table watching the next generation stand in the very place he himself once stood. He knew the restaurant would succeed. But more importantly, he knew a life had been restored. And sometimes that is the greatest accomplishment a leader can ever achieve. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture, the story of Jonathan and Liam reminds us that the true strength of a company does not lie in its systems, but in the way its leaders recognize the human being behind every working pair of hands. When a leader is brave enough to step down from the upper floors and face the truth that organization finally has the chance to be rebuilt from its very roots. If this story makes you believe in the value of compassion within the workplace, please like and subscribe so you do not miss other deeply human journeys. And comment the phrase, "new opportunity," to let me know you also believe that everyone deserves a chance to rise again.